Imagine this: Carnegie Hall, New York City, August 15th, 1963. The most prestigious concert venue in America, packed to capacity with over 2,000 people. The audience is a rare sight for this era. Black faces and white faces sitting side by side. Wealthy patrons in evening gowns and tuxedos. Working-class families who saved for months to afford a ticket. Students, critics, musicians. All of them here for one reason: Isaiah Bennett. At 28 years old, Isaiah is already a legend. The first black pianist to headline Carnegie Hall 3 times. A virtuoso who can make a Steinway grand sing like a choir of angels. Critics have called him the most important classical musician of his generation. Some say he's destined to be remembered alongside Rachmaninoff, Horowitz, and Rubinstein. Tonight's performance has been sold out for weeks. The anticipation is electric. People lean forward in their seats. The chandeliers dim slowly, casting dramatic shadows across the ornate ceiling. The murmur of conversation fades to silence. Then Isaiah walks onto the stage. He's wearing a simple black suit. No tails, no bow tie. Just a plain black suit that seems almost defiant in its simplicity. His face is calm, unreadable. He moves with the quiet dignity of a man who has made peace with a difficult decision. The audience erupts in applause, whistles, cheers, a standing ovation before he's even sat down. Isaiah acknowledges them with a small bow, then walks to the piano bench. The applause dies down. People settle back into their seats, ready for magic. Isaiah sits. He adjusts the bench slightly, lifts the piano lid, places his hands gently on the keys. His fingers, those miraculous fingers that have brought audiences to tears with Chopin nocturnes and Beethoven sonatas, hover over the ivory and ebony. The hall is completely silent now. 2,000 people holding their breath, and then nothing. Isaiah doesn't play. His hands remain on the keys, but he doesn't press them. Not a single note, not even a whisper of sound. He simply sits there perfectly still, staring at the piano, as if it holds the answer to a question too painful to ask out loud. 5 seconds pass, 10 seconds, 20. Confusion ripples through the audience. Is something wrong? Is he having a medical emergency? Did he forget the piece? People glance at each other, uncertain. Someone coughs. The sound echoes in the massive hall like a gunshot. 30 seconds. 45. Now the confusion is turning into something else. Frustration. Anger. A man in the balcony mutters loudly enough to be heard. "What the hell is going on?" A woman whispers urgently to her husband. "Is this some kind of joke?" 1 minute passes. Isaiah Bennett, the greatest pianist of his generation, has not played a single note, and he's not going to. Not for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. But why? Why would a man who spent his entire life mastering an instrument, a man who sacrificed everything for his art, sit in front of the most important audience of his career and refuse to play? Why would he risk his reputation, his career, his legacy, for silence? To understand that we need to go back. Back to where it all began. Back to a small house in Birmingham, Alabama, where a young boy first heard music and discovered that some sounds can change your life. And back to the moment years later when that same boy learned that silence can change the world. Birmingham, Alabama, 1935. This is the Deep South in the Jim Crow era, where the laws of segregation aren't just written on paper. They're carved into every aspect of daily life. Separate water fountains, separate restaurants, separate schools, separate worlds. And for a black child born into this reality, the word separate really means lesser. It means knowing your place. It means learning very early that your dreams have limits defined by the color of your skin. Isaiah Bennett was born on a sweltering July afternoon in a house on the black side of town, in a neighborhood where the streets weren't paved and the houses leaned slightly, as if tired from bearing the weight of too many broken promises. His father, William Bennett, was a carpenter, good with his hands. Could build almost anything if you gave him the wood and the time. But in Birmingham, there were only so many jobs a black man could get, and they all paid just enough to keep you alive, but never enough to get ahead. His mother, Ruth, worked as a domestic servant for a wealthy white family on the other side of town. The Hawthorns. She cleaned their house, cooked their meals, washed their clothes, raised their children while her own son spent his days with his grandmother. Ruth would leave before sunrise and return after dark, exhausted, her hands raw from lye soap and hot water. Isaiah was a quiet child, watchful, the kind of boy who noticed things. He noticed how his mother's shoulders sagged when she came home. He noticed how his father's jaw clenched when white men walked past without acknowledging him. He noticed the way people in his neighborhood moved through the world with a certain guardedness, always aware, always careful. But he also noticed beauty, the way morning light filtered through the magnolia trees, the rhythm of rain on a tin roof, the complicated harmonies of the church choir on Sunday mornings at Bethel Baptist, where his grandmother's voice soared above the congregation like hope itself. Music was everywhere in Birmingham's black community. It poured out of churches and juke joints from front porches and back alleys. Gospel and blues and jazz, all of it infused with something Isaiah couldn't name, but could feel. A kind of defiant joy, a refusal to let suffering have the last word. But the music that would change Isaiah's life didn't come from his own community. It came from the Hawthorne house where his mother worked. Isaiah was 7 years old the first time he heard it. His mother had taken him to work with her that day. It was summer, and his grandmother was sick, so there was no one else to watch him. Ruth made Isaiah promise to stay quiet, to make himself invisible. "Don't touch anything," she warned him. "Don't speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake, stay away from the piano! The piano!" Isaiah had never seen anything like it. It dominated the Hawthorns' living room like a piece of sculpture, all gleaming mahogany and ivory keys. A Steinway grand, though Isaiah didn't know the name for it then. To his 7-year-old eyes, it looked like something from another world, something sacred. He stood in the doorway staring at it while his mother cleaned the adjacent dining room. Then from somewhere upstairs, music began to float down. Someone was playing a record, a piano recording. The notes cascaded like water, like light, like something that reached inside Isaiah's chest and grabbed hold of his heart. It was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Isaiah wouldn't learn that until years later. At the time, all he knew was that he had never heard anything so beautiful. The music was sad and triumphant at the same time. It made him feel things he didn't have words for. It made him feel less alone. He moved closer to the piano without realizing it. His small hand reached out, hovering over the keys. What would it feel like to create something like that, to pull beauty out of wood and wire and ivory? "Don't you dare touch that piano, boy!" The voice was sharp cold. Isaiah jerked his hand back as if burned. Mrs. Hawthorne stood in the doorway, her face twisted with disgust. She was a thin woman with pale skin and paler eyes, the kind of person who seemed to wear her cruelty like expensive jewelry. "Do you know how much that instrument cost?" she said. "More than your mother will make in 10 years. And you think you can just put your dirty hands all over it?" Isaiah's mother appeared instantly, her face stricken with fear. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hawthorne. He didn't mean any harm. Isaiah, apologize right now." "I'm sorry," Isaiah whispered, tears burning his eyes. Mrs. Hawthorne sniffed. "See that it doesn't happen again. Ruth, keep that child away from my belongings." She left. Isaiah and his mother stood in heavy silence. Ruth pulled Isaiah close, her voice barely audible. "Baby, you can't. You understand that piano isn't for us. Nothing in this house is for us." But Isaiah couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying in his narrow bed, he heard the music again in his mind. The way the notes rose and fell, the way they seemed to tell a story without words. And he made a promise to himself. Someday, somehow, he would learn to play. That somehow arrived in the most unexpected way. Mrs. Hawthorne's daughter, Eleanor, was different from her mother. She was 19, home from college for the summer, and she had inherited her father's quiet kindness rather than her mother's cruelty. Eleanor had seen what happened that day, and unlike her mother, she saw a curious child, not a threat. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, when Mrs. Hawthorne was at her garden club meeting, Eleanor found Isaiah sitting on the back steps while his mother finished her work. "You're Ruth's son," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Isaiah nodded, wary. "You wanted to touch the piano?" she said. He nodded again, waiting for another lecture, but Eleanor smiled. "Would you like me to teach you?" Isaiah's eyes went wide. "Teach me to play the piano," Eleanor said. "I'm not as good as the recordings my mother plays, but I know enough. We'd have to be careful. Wednesday evenings when Mother is out. Can you keep a secret?" Could he keep a secret? Isaiah would have kept 1,000 secrets for this. For the next 3 years, every Wednesday evening became sacred. While Ruth cleaned upstairs, pretending not to notice, Eleanor taught Isaiah to play. She started with basics, how to position his hands, how to read music, simple scales and exercises. But Isaiah absorbed everything like dry earth soaking up rain. Eleanor quickly realized she was teaching someone exceptional. Isaiah had perfect pitch. He could hear a melody once and play it back. His fingers, still small and clumsy at first, developed a grace that took most students years to achieve. By age 9, he was playing Mozart. By 10, Chopin. "You have a gift," Eleanor told him one evening, her voice hushed with awe. "A real gift. I don't know how far you'll be able to take it in Alabama, but Isaiah, you could be great. You could be truly great." Isaiah believed her. In those secret Wednesday evening lessons, sitting at that forbidden piano, he felt more himself than anywhere else in the world. The piano didn't care about the color of his skin. The music didn't know about Jim Crow laws. When his fingers touched those keys, he was just a boy making beauty. He was free. But freedom is always temporary when it's built on borrowed time and secret grace. The lessons ended abruptly in 1945, when Isaiah was 10. Mrs. Hawthorne came home early from her garden club meeting. She heard piano music. She stormed into the living room and found her daughter teaching a black child to play their family's treasured Steinway. The explosion that followed was spectacular. Screaming, threats. Mrs. Hawthorne fired Ruth on the spot, called her ungrateful, called her a thief for allowing her son to touch their belongings. Eleanor tried to defend them, but her mother silenced her with a slap that echoed through the house. Isaiah and his mother left that night and never returned. Ruth found work with another family, but she made Isaiah swear he would never mention the piano lessons to anyone. "That part of your life is over," she said, her voice breaking. "You understand, some dreams aren't meant for boys like you." But Isaiah couldn't let it go. The music was inside him now. It had become part of his blood, his breath, his heartbeat, so he practiced in his mind. Every day he would replay the pieces he'd learned, his fingers moving against his thighs, as if pressing invisible keys. He hummed Chopin nocturnes while he helped his father with carpentry. He tapped out Bach fugues on the dinner table until his mother told him to stop. At school, the music teacher, Mr. Freeman, noticed Isaiah's obsession. Freeman was an older black man who had once played with Duke Ellington's band before settling down in Birmingham to teach. He had an old, battered, upright piano in his classroom. He saw the way Isaiah looked at it with the hunger of someone starving. "You know how to play?" Freeman asked one day. Isaiah hesitated, then nodded. "Show me." Isaiah sat down and played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major from memory. His technique was rusty from years without practice, but the musicality was undeniable. The soul was there. Freeman listened with his eyes closed. When Isaiah finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Boy, you've got something special. But in 1945, Birmingham, Alabama special isn't enough. You need to be extraordinary. You need to be so good that they can't ignore you. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Isaiah said. "Then come to this classroom every day after school. We'll work. But I need you to understand something. This road you're choosing. It's going to be harder than anything you can imagine. They're going to tell you that you don't belong, that classical music isn't for your kind, that you're reaching above your station. Are you ready for that?" Isaiah thought about the Steinway in the Hawthorne house. He thought about his mother's exhausted face. He thought about the music that lived inside him, demanding to be set free. "Yes, sir," he said again. "I'm ready." But he wasn't. Not really. No one could be ready for what was coming. No one could be ready for the weight of being the first, the only, the exception that people pointed to as proof that the system worked, while that same system crushed 1,000 other dreams just like his. Still, Isaiah practiced. Every day after school, he and Mr. Freeman worked on technique, on repertoire, on the complicated dance of bringing black musicality to European classical forms. Freeman taught him to play with technical precision and emotional depth. He taught him to honor the composers while bringing his own truth to their notes. "Don't try to play like a white pianist," Freeman said. "And don't try to play like a black pianist trying to prove he's as good as a white pianist. Play like Isaiah Bennett. Play the truth of who you are. That's the only thing that matters." Isaiah absorbed those words like scripture. For 7 years he practiced. Through middle school and high school. Through the daily humiliations of segregation. Through watching his father's back bend further every year and his mother's hands become more gnarled from other people's housework. Through it all, the piano was his refuge, his resistance, his hope. And then, in the spring of 1952, the impossible happened. Isaiah was 17, a senior at Parker High School, when Mr. Freeman pulled him aside one afternoon. The old man's hands were shaking. "Isaiah," he said, "I sent a recording of your playing to a friend of mine, a professor at Juilliard." Juilliard. The word hung in the air like a miracle. "They want to offer you a full scholarship," Freeman said. His eyes were wet. "Full scholarship, Isaiah. Room, board, tuition. Everything. You're going to New York." Isaiah couldn't breathe. New York. Juilliard. The most prestigious music conservatory in America. It was impossible. It was everything. It was terrifying. Because in 1945, Alabama, a black boy with dreams of Carnegie Hall, might as well have been dreaming of the moon. But now somehow, someone had built him a rocket. The question was, would he survive the flight? September 1952. Isaiah Bennett stepped off the train at Pennsylvania Station with one battered suitcase and a heart full of hope and terror. New York City hit him like a physical force. The noise, the crowds, the buildings that seemed to scrape the sky itself. Birmingham had been small, contained, predictable in its cruelty. New York was vast and chaotic and overwhelming. Thousands of people rushed past him without a glance, each absorbed in their own urgent business. But there were black faces everywhere. Not just porters and maids, but businessmen in suits, women in fashionable dresses, students with books, artists with paint-stained fingers. Isaiah had never seen so many black people moving through the world with their heads up, with purpose, with dignity. For a moment, he let himself believe that things might be different here. That maybe in New York, talent would matter more than skin color. That maybe here, he could just be a musician. The illusion didn't last long. Juilliard was located in Morningside Heights, in a grand building that proclaimed the importance of high art and serious music. Isaiah arrived for his first day with his second-hand suit pressed, sharp. His shoes polished until they gleamed, and his determination hardened like armor. The other students stared. Some with curiosity, some with thinly veiled hostility. One boy, blond and expensively dressed, looked Isaiah up and down and said loudly to his friend, "I didn't know they were letting just anyone in now." Isaiah kept his face neutral, but the message was clear. This was still America. The rules were different here, more subtle, more sophisticated. But they existed. His dorm room was small, but clean. His roommate, a Jewish boy from Brooklyn named David Steinberg, was friendly enough. "Don't mind the old money crowd," David said, unpacking his own bag. "Half of them can barely play. They're here because their parents paid for a building or something. You actually have talent. That's what matters." Isaiah wanted to believe him. The first few weeks were brutal. Not because of the music. Isaiah could handle the music. He'd been preparing for years. The Chopin etudes, the Beethoven sonatas, the Bach preludes and fugues. He could play them all. His technique was solid. His interpretations were fresh, infused with the emotional depth that Mr. Freeman had taught him to embrace. No, the difficulty wasn't the music. It was everything else. The casual racism that appeared in small moments, a professor who consistently mispronounced his name even after corrections, students who assumed he was there on some kind of diversity quota, not merit. The way people would fall silent when he entered the practice rooms, as if his presence disrupted something sacred. And then there were the larger structural barriers. The way certain opportunities seemed to go to students with the right last names, the right connections. The way guest artists would visit and somehow never have time to mentor the black students. The way auditions were blind, but somehow the results still reflected familiar patterns. Isaiah learned quickly that he would have to be twice as good to get half as far. So he practiced twice as hard. While other students slept, he was in the practice rooms. While they socialized, he studied scores. While they coasted on talent and privilege, He worked with the desperate intensity of someone who knew that one mistake, one moment of weakness could be used as proof that he didn't belong. By his second year, the work was paying off. His professors, even the reluctant ones, couldn't deny his ability. He won the concerto competition, earning the right to perform Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto with the Juilliard Orchestra. The performance was transcendent. Critics from the New York Times and other major papers attended. They praised his remarkable technique and surprising emotional depth. Surprising, as if a black pianist having emotional depth was unexpected. But Isaiah took what he could get. Recognition, even backhanded recognition, opened doors. He started getting offers to perform. Small venues at first, church basements, community centers. But gradually the venues grew larger, more prestigious. By 1955, at age 20, Isaiah was beginning to build a real career. He'd performed with several regional orchestras. He'd given recitals in Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Critics were starting to call him a major new talent and one to watch. But Isaiah felt increasingly conflicted. Was he succeeding because of his music, or because he was being used as proof that the system worked? Every time someone praised him, were they really praising him, or just congratulating themselves for being open-minded enough to appreciate a black pianist? And there was another question that haunted him. A question that would eventually lead to that silent moment at Carnegie Hall. What did it mean to play white music as a black man in America? Was he celebrating the beauty of European classical tradition? Or was he abandoning his own culture? When he played Beethoven and Chopin, was he honoring universal human expression? Or was he performing a kind of cultural assimilation that erased his own truth? These questions swirled in Isaiah's mind throughout his early 20s. He didn't have answers. He just kept playing, kept working, kept proving himself over and over and over again until the proof itself became exhausting. And then came that night in Harlem, the night that would change everything. It was May 1957. Isaiah was 22 in his final year at Juilliard. His graduation was only weeks away, and his career was on the verge of breaking through to the next level. He'd been offered a management contract with a prestigious agency. There were plans for a major debut recital at Town Hall. Everything was coming together. That Friday evening, David Steinberg invited Isaiah to join him at a jazz club in Harlem. The Blue Note. David was dating a girl who waitressed there, and he wanted moral support. Isaiah hesitated. He didn't know much about jazz. His world was Beethoven and Brahms, structured and notated where every note was predetermined by the composer. Jazz seemed like chaos to him, improvisation, disorder, the opposite of everything he'd been trained to value. But David insisted. "Come on, man. You can't live in New York and never experience the jazz scene. Besides, you need to relax. You're wound tighter than a piano string." So Isaiah went. The Blue Note was small and crowded thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of whiskey. The stage was barely raised, just a few inches above the floor, creating an intimacy between musicians and audience that Isaiah had never experienced in concert halls. The crowd was mixed. Black, white, Latino, Asian. Artists and intellectuals and workers and students all crammed together in the dark, unified by the music. The band that night was a quintet led by a young trumpeter named Marcus Williams. Isaiah had never heard of him, but from the first note, it was clear the man was extraordinary. His trumpet sang and wailed and whispered, telling stories that shifted and evolved with each phrase. The pianist, a man with gray in his beard and ancient wisdom in his fingers, created landscapes of sound that the other musicians navigated like explorers. Isaiah was transfixed. This wasn't chaos at all. It was a different kind of order, a conversation between musicians, each listening intently to the others, responding, supporting, challenging. They were creating something in real time that could never be exactly replicated. Each performance was unique, alive, ephemeral. It was beautiful in a way that Isaiah hadn't expected. Freer than classical music, but no less demanding, no less serious, no less profound. He was watching the bassist take a solo, lost in the hypnotic pulse of the music, when the door burst open. Police. 4 white officers, hands on their holsters, faces hard. The music stopped instantly. The room tensed. "This is a raid," the lead officer announced. "We've had complaints about noise violations and illegal alcohol sales. Everyone stay where you are." But it was clear this wasn't really about noise or alcohol. The officers moved through the crowd, checking IDs, asking aggressive questions. They were particularly rough with the black patrons, especially the black men. The white customers were questioned briefly and released. The black customers were detained, pushed toward the wall. Isaiah watched as they grabbed Marcus Williams, the trumpeter, and shoved him against the bar. "You got a permit for this performance?" the officer demanded. "Yes, sir. Everything's legal," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. "Don't lie to me, boy." Boy. The word cut through the room like a knife. They arrested Marcus and 2 other band members on fabricated charges, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, though no one had resisted. The crowd protested, but quietly, carefully. Everyone knew that speaking up could mean becoming the next target. Isaiah and David weren't arrested. David because he was white. Isaiah because he'd kept his head down, stayed quiet, made himself small. He hated himself for it, but he'd learned survival. As the police led the musicians out in handcuffs, the room fell silent. Complete, heavy silence. It was the silence of rage with nowhere to go. The silence of humiliation. The silence of knowing that your dignity could be stripped away at any moment for any reason or for no reason at all. Isaiah sat in that silence, and something shifted inside him. He thought about all the years he'd spent mastering European classical music. All the hours perfecting his technique, learning to play pieces written by dead white men for audiences of living white people. He'd told himself it was about universal beauty, about transcending race through art. But in that moment, sitting in that silenced jazz club, he understood something new. There was no transcending race in America. Not really. Because no matter how well he played, no matter how many standing ovations he received, no matter how many critics praised his surprising emotional depth, he was still a black man in a country that saw black people as threats to be controlled. And he realized something else, something that would eventually lead him to that moment at Carnegie Hall. Sometimes the most powerful sound isn't music. It's silence. Deliberate, chosen, meaningful silence. The silence in that club after the police left wasn't empty. It was full of everything that couldn't be safely spoken, full of anger and sorrow and solidarity. That silence communicated more than any song could have. Isaiah left the club that night with his mind racing. He walked the streets of Harlem until dawn, thinking, processing. The city was just waking up when he finally returned to his dorm room. David was already up making coffee. "Hell of a night," he said. "Yeah," Isaiah said. But he wasn't thinking about the raid anymore. He was thinking about silence, about what it means, about what it says when you choose not to speak, not to play, not to fill the air with sound. He was thinking about John Cage. Isaiah had heard about John Cage's infamous piece 433 back in 1952, the year it premiered. The music world had been scandalized, a composition consisting entirely of silence, 3 movements of nothing. It was either genius or the ultimate con, depending on who you asked. Most of Isaiah's professors at Juilliard dismissed it as a gimmick. That's not music, they'd say. That's philosophy pretending to be art. They'd sneer at Cage's experimental approach, his interest in chance and randomness and silence. But after that night in Harlem, Isaiah became obsessed with understanding what Cage had been trying to do. He spent the next several months researching. He read everything he could find about Cage's philosophy. He learned about Cage's experience in the anechoic chamber at Harvard, where he'd expected to hear absolute silence, but instead heard the sound of his own nervous system and blood circulation. He learned about Cage's interest in Zen Buddhism and the idea that there's no such thing as true silence, that even in the absence of intentional sound, there's always something to hear. There is no such thing as silence, Cage had said. Something is always happening that makes a sound. Isaiah understood the concept intellectually, but he felt like something was missing. Cage's 433 was about the impossibility of silence, about listening to ambient sound, about challenging the definition of music. But what if silence could mean something more? What if it could be a statement, a protest, a refusal? What if silence could be the loudest thing you could say? Isaiah thought about that silent jazz club. He thought about how the audience's silence had communicated rage and solidarity more powerfully than any words could have. He thought about the silence of people who aren't allowed to speak, the silence forced on communities that are systematically ignored and marginalized. And he thought about how he, as a Black classical pianist, was expected to perform. Expected to play the right notes in the right way to fit into a tradition that had never been designed to include him. Expected to be grateful for the opportunity. Expected to prove over and over that he belonged. What if he refused? What if he sat at that piano in front of that audience and played nothing? What would that silence mean? What would it say? But these were just abstract ideas. Isaiah was still focused on building his career. He graduated from Juilliard in the spring of 1957 with highest honors. His town hall debut that fall was a triumph. Critics praised his commanding technique and mature musicality. Doors continued to open. Over the next several years, Isaiah's career flourished in the way he'd always dreamed. He performed with major orchestras. He toured internationally. He recorded albums that sold well. By his mid-20s, he was one of the most sought-after pianists in America. But success brought its own complications. With each achievement, Isaiah felt the weight of representation growing heavier. He wasn't just Isaiah Bennett anymore. He was the Black pianist. Every performance was scrutinized not just for its artistic merit, but for what it said about whether Black musicians belonged in classical music. When he played well, people said, "See if you work hard enough, race doesn't matter." When he played less than perfectly, the criticism had an edge to it, a suggestion that maybe this experiment of integration had its limits after all. And there was always the tension with his own community. Some Black people celebrated his success. Others accused him of selling out, of abandoning Black musical traditions for white approval. "Why aren't you playing our music?" they'd ask. "Why are you playing music written by people who would have enslaved your ancestors?" Isaiah didn't have good answers. He loved the music he played. He loved Bach and Beethoven and Chopin. But he also understood their point. Classical music had been used as a tool of cultural dominance, a way to define civilization in terms that excluded and devalued Black artistic traditions. So where did that leave him? Was it possible to love something that didn't love you back? to participate in a tradition that had systematically excluded people who looked like you? These questions haunted Isaiah throughout the late 1950s and early 60s. He kept playing, kept performing, but the internal conflict grew. He felt like he was living in multiple worlds that couldn't quite reconcile. The world of classical music, which celebrated him while never quite accepting him. The world of his family and community, which supported him while questioning his choices. And the world inside his own head, where he wrestled with what it all meant. Then came 1963. The year everything would change. The year the personal and the political would collide in a way that Isaiah could no longer ignore. The year he would discover that sometimes the bravest thing an artist can do is refuse to perform. By 1962, Isaiah Bennett had achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a child in Birmingham. At 27, he was performing regularly with America's finest orchestras. His recordings received critical acclaim. He'd been featured in Time magazine's music section. He'd even performed at the White House for President Kennedy. He was successful, famous even, and utterly exhausted. The exhaustion wasn't physical. Isaiah was young and healthy, capable of maintaining the brutal schedule of a touring musician. The exhaustion was deeper. It was the bone-deep tiredness that comes from constantly proving yourself, from navigating spaces where you're technically allowed but never quite welcome, from representing an entire race every time you sit at a piano. The touring was particularly difficult. In 1962, America, even a famous black musician, faced the indignities of Jim Crow in southern states. Hotels that would host his concerts refused to give him a room. Restaurants near the concert halls wouldn't serve him. He'd perform for white audiences in the evening and then have to drive hours to find a black neighborhood where he could eat and sleep. In Memphis, after a triumphant performance of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, Isaiah went to the restaurant across from the concert hall, still in his tuxedo, to celebrate. The maitre d' stopped him at the door. "We don't serve your kind here," he said quietly. "I just performed across the street," Isaiah said, his voice controlled but tight. Half the people in this restaurant were probably in that audience. The maitre d' shrugged. "That's different. The concert hall is neutral territory. This is our restaurant. We have standards. Standards." The word was a knife. Isaiah left. He'd experienced this kind of thing countless times, but it never stopped hurting. The contradiction of being celebrated on stage and rejected off it. The way his artistry was valued, but his humanity wasn't. And there were other contradictions that troubled him even more deeply. He'd noticed the demographics of his audiences. Overwhelmingly white, wealthy. The cost of tickets to hear him play Beethoven was more than most black families in America could afford. So he was performing primarily for the very people whose ancestors had enslaved his ancestors. Playing music from a European tradition that had been used to define civilization, in contrast to supposedly primitive African cultures. Was he participating in his own oppression? Or was he proving that black people could excel in any tradition they chose? He didn't know. And the not knowing was eating him alive. Friends noticed his increasing withdrawal. David Steinberg, who'd remained close since their Juilliard days, tried to talk to him about it. "You seem angry all the time now," David said over drinks one evening in New York. "What's going on?" "I'm tired," Isaiah said. "Tired of being the example. The exception. The proof that the system works. Every time someone praises me, I wonder if they're really praising me or just congratulating themselves for being enlightened enough to appreciate a black pianist." "Does it matter?" David asked. "You're making beautiful music. That's what counts." But Isaiah wasn't sure anymore that music was enough. Not when his people were fighting for basic human rights, and he was spending his days perfecting his interpretation of Chopin nocturnes. The internal conflict came to a head in the spring of 1963, a year that would prove to be one of the most pivotal in American civil rights history. 1963 began with hope. President Kennedy had spoken about civil rights. There was momentum building. The civil rights movement was gaining visibility and support, but the year quickly became marked by violence and tragedy. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham during protests against segregation. From his jail cell, he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail addressing white moderates who counseled patience and gradual change. "We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights," King wrote. "The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we stiff creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter." Isaiah read those words and felt them like a punch to the gut. He was from Birmingham. That was his city. Those were his people being beaten by police, attacked by dogs, blasted with fire hoses. And where was he in New York, preparing for his next concert, practicing Liszt etudes while his community fought for survival? In May, the Birmingham campaign reached its peak. Thousands of protesters, including children, filled the streets. The images broadcast on television were horrifying. Police Commissioner Bull Connor ordered officers to use dogs and fire hoses against protesters. Children, some as young as 6 years old, were knocked off their feet by water pressure strong enough to strip bark off trees. Isaiah watched the news with his hands clenched so tight his nails drew blood. He recognized some of the streets. That was 16th Street. That was Kelly Ingram Park. Those were places he'd walked as a child. He called his mother in Birmingham. She was terrified, but defiant. "We're going to win this," she said. "It's going to cost us, but we're going to win." "How are you, baby?" "I'm fine," Isaiah lied. "Just working." After he hung up, he sat at his piano for hours, unable to play. The instrument that had been his refuge, his voice, his salvation, felt suddenly meaningless. What did Beethoven's sonatas matter when children were being attacked by dogs? But the worst was yet to come. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Isaiah was there. He'd canceled a performance in Chicago to attend. He stood in the massive crowd surrounded by humanity, black and white together, and listened as speaker after speaker called for justice and equality. And then Martin Luther King Jr. took the podium and delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Isaiah had heard King speak before, but this was different. This wasn't a sermon in a church or a speech at a rally. This was a declaration to the nation, to the world. King's voice rang out over the mall, painting a vision of an America that could be, should be, must be. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood." Isaiah wept. He wasn't alone. All around him, people were crying not from sadness but from hope, from the sheer power of imagining a different world. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." This was what mattered. This struggle for human dignity. This fight for justice. Not his concert schedule. Not his critical reviews. Not his carefully crafted interpretations of European masters. But what could he do? He was a pianist, not an activist. His skill was playing music, not organizing protests. How could he contribute to this movement, The answer would come in the most terrible way. September 15th, 1963. Less than 3 weeks after the triumphant march on Washington. A Sunday morning. 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan planted dynamite outside the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. At 10:22 a.m. during Sunday school, the bomb exploded. 4 girls were killed instantly. Addie Mae Collins, 14 years old. Cynthia Wesley, 14. Carol Robertson, 14. Carol Denise McNair, 11. They were in the church basement preparing for the Sunday service. 4 children murdered for the crime of being black in Birmingham, Alabama. When Isaiah heard the news, something inside him broke. Not cracked, not damaged. Broke completely. Shattered into pieces that could never be put back together in quite the same way. He knew that church. He'd attended services there as a child. He could picture exactly where the girls had been. The Sunday school rooms in the basement. He might have sat in those very rooms learning Bible verses, singing hymns, dreaming of a future that seemed impossibly distant, but maybe reachable if you worked hard enough and believed in God and America. Those girls had probably had dreams too. Dreams that ended at 14 at 11 because someone decided their lives didn't matter. Isaiah didn't go to his scheduled rehearsal that day, or the next day, or the day after that. He stayed in his apartment, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but stare at the walls and try to understand how this was possible. How in 1963 in America, children could be blown apart in a house of God and the machinery of the state would do nothing. How the nation could watch this happen and not rise up in collective horror and demand immediate radical change. His manager called repeatedly. Isaiah didn't answer. His agent sent telegrams. Isaiah ignored them. The world wanted him to keep performing, keep smiling, keep playing pretty music for comfortable audiences. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Not after Birmingham. On the 4th day, David Steinberg showed up at Isaiah's apartment unannounced. He let himself in with the spare key Isaiah had given him years ago. He found Isaiah sitting at the piano, his hands hovering over the keys, not playing. Isaiah, David said softly. Isaiah didn't respond. David sat on the couch. For a long time, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. Finally, Isaiah spoke, his voice hoarse. How am I supposed to play music after this? How am I supposed to sit at a piano and play Chopin while children are being murdered, while my people are dying? I don't know, David said. I can't do it, Isaiah said. I can't keep pretending that music exists in some pure space above politics and history and suffering. It doesn't. Nothing does. Every time I play, I'm making a choice about what to lift up, what to celebrate, what to give my energy to. And I've been choosing the music of people who would have considered me less than human. Why? To prove I'm civilized. To prove I'm worthy to whom? For what? David didn't have answers. He just listened. But I can't walk away either. Isaiah continued. Music is who I am. It's in my blood. The piano saved my life. It gave me a way out of Birmingham, a way to dream beyond what my circumstances said was possible. I love music. I love this art form even with all its problems and contradictions. I don't want to give it up. Then don't, David said. But I can't keep doing what I've been doing. I can't keep performing as if nothing has changed, as if Birmingham didn't happen, as if those girls didn't die. So what will you do? Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know yet, but it has to be something that honors the truth, something that doesn't look away from the horror, something that uses my platform, my privilege as a successful musician to say what needs to be said." Over the next several days, an idea began to form. It was audacious, possibly career-ending, but it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right for a long time. Isaiah thought about John Cage and 433. He thought about that night in the Harlem Jazz Club and the powerful silence after the police raid. He thought about the silence of the girls in Birmingham, whose voices had been violently stolen. He thought about the silence of white America, which watched atrocities and said nothing, did nothing. And he thought about what it would mean to bring all of that silence to Carnegie Hall, to the heart of the cultural establishment, to make the most prestigious audience in America sit with that silence, feel its weight, confront what it means. It would be a performance about the refusal to perform, a piece of music about the failure of music to address injustice, a moment of silence that spoke louder than any note he could play. It was risky, possibly insane, but it felt necessary, urgent, true. Isaiah picked up the phone and called his manager. "I want to book Carnegie Hall," he said. "August 15th, 1 year after the March on Washington. I have something important to say." "Isaiah, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for days. You missed, I know. I'm sorry. But I need Carnegie Hall. Can you make it happen?" There was a pause. Then, "What are you planning to play?" Isaiah hesitated. Then he said, "You'll have to wait and see. But I promise you it will be the most important performance of my career." His manager agreed, though reluctantly. Carnegie Hall was booked. August 15th, 1963. The date was set. Now Isaiah just had to find the courage to follow through. Because what he was planning would either change his life or end his career. And he wouldn't know which until he sat down at that piano in front of 2,000 people and played nothing. In the weeks following his booking of Carnegie Hall, Isaiah began to develop the details of what he would do. It couldn't just be silence. That had been done. Cage had done it, and brilliantly. Isaiah needed something that built on Cage's insight, but added his own truth, his own purpose. He decided on a structure. He would indeed sit silently for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, honoring Cage's groundbreaking work. But in the final movement, instead of pure silence, he would introduce something else. Recorded sound. Actual sounds from the civil rights movement. Sounds that white America had been trying not to hear. Isaiah spent days in the library researching. He collected recordings, excerpts from Martin Luther King's speeches, the sound of police dogs barking during Birmingham protests, the voices of children singing freedom songs, the explosion, God, the explosion from the church bombing. And underneath it all, silence. The silence of complicity. The silence of injustice. It would be uncomfortable, painful, confrontational. Everything that classical music audiences weren't used to. Everything they didn't want from their entertainment. Perfect. But even as Isaiah planned, doubt gnawed at him. Was he making a mistake? Was he throwing away everything he'd worked for? His entire career had been built on his ability to play the piano better than almost anyone else alive. And now he was planning to sit at Carnegie Hall and not play at all. His manager was horrified when Isaiah finally explained the plan. "You can't be serious," Marcus Feldman said, his face pale. "You're going to sit there and do nothing, Isaiah? This will ruin you. You understand that critics will eviscerate you. You'll be laughed out of the profession." "Maybe," Isaiah said. "Maybe there's no maybe about it. Do you have any idea how much goodwill you've built up? How many doors have opened for you? You're on the verge of becoming one of the truly great pianists of your generation. And you want to throw it all away for a political stunt? It's not a stunt. Then what is it? It's the truth, Isaiah said quietly. It's what needs to be said. Or rather, what needs to be heard. The silence that everyone is pretending isn't happening. Feldman shook his head. I think you're making a terrible mistake. But if you're determined to do this, at least let me help you manage the fallout. We need to prepare a statement. Frame this properly. Emphasize the artistic intent, downplay the political aspect. No, Isaiah said firmly. The political aspect is the whole point. I'm not going to hide that. I'm not going to soften it. That's what I've been doing my whole career, making white audiences comfortable, proving I'm safe, showing them that a black man can perform their music their way. I'm done with that. This time I'm going to make them uncomfortable. And if it costs me my career, so be it. Feldman sighed. You're a stubborn man, Isaiah Bennett. I learned from the best, Isaiah said, thinking of his mother, his father, Mr. Freeman. All the people who had taught him that sometimes principle matters more than prudence. Word began to leak out about what Isaiah was planning. Not the details, he'd kept those secret, but the general idea that his Carnegie Hall performance would be unconventional and politically charged. The response from the classical music establishment was swift and harsh. One prominent critic wrote a preemptive column in the New York Times warning against the dangerous conflation of art and politics. He didn't name Isaiah directly, but the target was clear. Great music transcends the mundane concerns of daily life, the critic wrote. When artists attempt to use the concert hall as a platform for political propaganda, they diminish both the art form and their own talents. Another critic in the Boston Globe was more direct. Isaiah Bennett is one of the finest pianists of his generation. It would be a tragedy if he threw away his gifts on trendy activism. The concert hall should remain a sanctuary from politics, a place where we can all appreciate beauty regardless of our political differences. Isaiah read these pieces with a mixture of anger and bitter amusement. A sanctuary from politics. As if the concert hall hadn't always been political. As if deciding what music was great and who was allowed to perform it wasn't political. As if the very existence of segregated audiences wasn't political. But the criticism wasn't just from white critics. Some members of the black community also questioned what Isaiah was doing. A jazz musician, Isaiah respected an older man who'd known his mentor, Mr. Freeman, pulled him aside at a gathering in Harlem. I hear you're planning something at Carnegie Hall, the man said. Something about silence. Yes, sir, Isaiah said. The man was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he said, You playing Cage 433? Something like that. But different. More purposeful. The man nodded slowly. You know what some folks are saying? They're saying you're abandoning black music, that you're so caught up in the white classical world that you've forgotten where you come from, that you're doing experimental white boy art instead of standing with your people. The words hurt because there was some truth in them. Isaiah had chosen a career in classical music, a predominantly white space. He'd spent years perfecting the music of European composers, while his own community developed jazz and blues and gospel. I haven't forgotten where I come from, Isaiah said quietly. That's exactly why I'm doing this. Because I can't keep playing pretty music while my people are suffering. This silence, it's about Birmingham. It's about the March on Washington. It's about all the ways that black voices are silenced in this country. The older musician studied him. Then he nodded. All right. I hear you. Just make sure when you get up on that stage, you're doing it for the right reasons. Not to make white people uncomfortable, though, that's a bonus, but to honor our people. to bear witness. Can you do that? I'm going to try, Isaiah said. Then I'll be there, the man said. Front row, watching. Don't let us down, young brother. The pressure was immense. Isaiah felt the weight of expectation from all sides. The white classical establishment expected him to fail to prove that black musicians didn't really understand serious music. His black critics expected him to fail differently to prove that he'd lost touch with his roots. And his supporters, the few who existed, expected him to somehow pull off a miracle, to create something that would justify the risk. Isaiah wasn't sure he could meet anyone's expectations. He was just trying to tell the truth as he understood it, to use his platform to say something that felt urgent and necessary. Whether that would be enough, he didn't know. The week before the performance, Isaiah barely slept. He went over every detail, the timing, the recorded sounds he would use, the statement he would read afterward. He practiced sitting still, which was harder than he'd expected. For a performer used to movement and expression and technical display, stillness felt like drowning. His mother called from Birmingham. "Baby, I hear you're doing something special at your concert. Your father and I are so proud of you." "You might not be proud after you see what I'm planning," Isaiah said. "Whatever you do, we'll be proud," Ruth said firmly. "You've always followed your heart. That's all any parent can ask." Isaiah wished he had his mother's confidence. He felt increasingly like he was walking toward a cliff edge, about to jump, without knowing if there was water below or rocks. 2 days before the performance, David Steinberg came by Isaiah's apartment. He found his friend sitting at the piano, hands on the keys, not playing. "You've been sitting like that a lot lately," David observed. "Practicing," Isaiah said. "Practicing not playing." "Exactly." David sat down. "Are you scared?" Isaiah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Terrified. What if no one understands? What if they just think I'm lazy or crazy or a fraud? What if I destroy everything I've worked for and it doesn't even matter, doesn't even make people think or change anything? "Those are all possibilities," David said, honestly. "But what's the alternative? You keep performing like nothing's wrong. You keep being the safe, talented black pianist who plays the music white audiences love. Is that really better?" Isaiah knew the answer. "No, it's not better. It's just easier." "You've never chosen easy," David said. "Why start now?" The night before the performance, Isaiah couldn't stay in his apartment. He walked the streets of Manhattan, watching the city pulse with life. Taxis honking, people hurrying home from work, street vendors selling hot dogs. The ordinary machinery of daily life continuing regardless of what Isaiah was about to do. He found himself at Riverside Park, sitting on a bench, overlooking the Hudson River. The water was dark and endless, reflecting the lights from New Jersey. Isaiah thought about the journey that had brought him here. From that house in Birmingham, to Juilliard, to concert halls around the world, to this moment, sitting on a bench, preparing to commit what might be professional suicide. But it didn't feel like suicide. It felt like the most honest thing he'd ever done. His entire career had been about proving he could play as well as anyone, about gaining acceptance in a world that didn't want him. Tomorrow, he would stop asking for acceptance. He would demand recognition, not of his talent, but of his humanity, of his people's humanity. Tomorrow, he would make silence speak louder than any note he'd ever played. As the sun set over New Jersey, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Isaiah made a promise to himself. No matter what happened, no matter how the audience reacted or what the critics wrote, he would see this through. He would sit at that piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and let the silence say everything that needed to be said. He would not apologize. He would not explain or soften or make it palatable. He would just bear witness. And in bearing witness, maybe, just maybe, he would create a space for truth. Isaiah stayed by the river until full dark, then walked back to his apartment. He didn't sleep much that night, but he didn't need to. He was ready. Tomorrow, Carnegie Hall. Tomorrow, the performance that would define his life. Tomorrow, silence would break. August 15th, 1963, 6 p.m. Isaiah Bennett stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, his hands shaking slightly. He pressed them against his thighs, willing them to be still. He could hear the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain. 2,000 voices blending into a sound like distant ocean waves. His manager, Marcus Feldman, hovered nearby, looking anxious. "It's not too late," Feldman said for the 10th time. "You could still do a regular program. Play the Chopin Ballade. Play Rachmaninoff. Give them what they expect. No one would fault you for changing your mind." Isaiah shook his head. "I'm not changing my mind." "Isaiah Marcus, please, I need to focus." Feldman fell silent, but his disapproval was tangible. A stagehand poked his head around the curtain. "5 minutes, Mr. Bennett. 5 minutes." Isaiah's heart hammered against his ribs. He closed his eyes and thought about Birmingham, about the 4 girls, about his mother scrubbing white people's floors, about that night in the Harlem Jazz Club, about everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about the weight of silence. How silence can be violence when it means not speaking against injustice. How silence can be power when it means refusing to perform, refusing to entertain, refusing to make people comfortable. He thought about John Cage sitting at a piano in Woodstock, New York, writing a piece that would challenge everything people thought they knew about music. Cage had been brave, crazy brave. Isaiah would have to be equally brave tonight. 2 minutes, Mr. Bennett. Isaiah opened his eyes. His hands had stopped shaking. Something settled in his chest. Not calm exactly, but determination. Purpose. He was going to do this. And whatever happened next, happened. He walked to the edge of the stage curtain and peered out at the audience. They were settling into their seats. He saw faces he recognized. Critics from major papers, fellow musicians from Juilliard, wealthy patrons who'd followed his career, and there in the front row the old jazz musician from Harlem who'd challenged him. The man caught Isaiah's eye and gave a small nod. Isaiah nodded back. He also saw black faces scattered through the audience. Not many Carnegie Hall tickets weren't cheap, and the classical music world remained overwhelmingly white. But there were some. Community members who'd scraped together the ticket price because they'd heard Isaiah was doing something important. They were watching him with hope and expectation. "Don't let us down, young brother." Isaiah took a deep breath. "You're on, Mr. Bennett." The house lights dimmed. The audience noise faded to silence. The curtain opened. Isaiah walked onto the stage. The applause was immediate and thunderous, a standing ovation before he'd done anything. People cheered, whistled. Some in the audience were crying, already overwhelmed by what Isaiah represented. The first, the breakthrough, the proof that a black man could stand on this stage and command this space. Isaiah stood center stage and let the applause wash over him. He didn't smile or wave. He just stood, absorbing the moment, understanding that this might be the last time he received this kind of ovation from this kind of audience. When the applause finally died down and people settled back into their seats, Isaiah walked to the piano. The Steinway Grand gleamed under the stage lights. Beautiful, familiar, his oldest friend and his most complicated relationship. He sat on the bench, adjusted it slightly. The small mechanical sound seemed enormous in the silent hall. He lifted the piano lid, setting it on the long stick. The action produced a gentle thud that echoed. Isaiah placed his hands on the keys. The position was perfect. Fingers, curved wrists, relaxed elbows at the proper angle. Everything he'd learned from Eleanor Hawthorne, from Mr. Freeman, from his professors at Juilliard. 20 years of training, thousands of hours of practice, all leading to this moment. The audience leaned forward, anticipating. Isaiah looked at the keys, ivory and ebony, black and white existing together in a pattern that created music. He thought about how piano keys were made from elephant tusks and tropical hardwoods materials taken from Africa to create the instruments of European music. Even the piano itself was a symbol of colonialism, of taking and transforming and claiming. But it was also just an instrument, a tool. And tools could be used in service of any purpose, any truth. Isaiah took one last deep breath, and then he sat still. Isaiah's hands remained on the keys, but he didn't press them. He sat perfectly still, staring at the piano, his face calm. The stage lights cast his shadow long across the polished wood floor. For the first 10 seconds, the audience waited patiently. This must be part of the performance, they thought. A moment of meditation before the music begins. They'd seen pianists do this before, taking a moment to center themselves. But 10 seconds became 20. 20 became 30, and Isaiah still hadn't moved. Confusion rippled through Carnegie Hall. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed a sharp, dry sound that seemed to echo forever in the silence. Someone else cleared their throat. A program rustled. Isaiah continued to sit, unmoving. 40 seconds. 50. A full minute. Now the confusion was turning into something else. Whispers started in the balcony and spread downward. What's happening? Is he all right? Is this part of the performance? A woman in the third row leaned to her husband. Maybe he's having some kind of breakdown. The whispers grew louder. Isaiah could hear them, but he didn't react. He kept his eyes on the piano, his hands on the keys, his body still. This was the silence he'd planned, the silence of anticipation turning into discomfort, the silence that makes people aware of their own sounds, their own presence. 1 minute, 15 seconds. 1 minute, 20. Someone in the balcony said loudly, "Is this a joke?" The question hung in the air. Was it a joke? Was Isaiah Bennett, the celebrated virtuoso, making fools of them all? Had they paid good money to watch a man sit silently at a piano? 1 minute, 30 seconds. The first movement was over. In Cage's 433, this would be when the pianist would do something. Lift their hands, turn a page, make some acknowledgement of the structure. Isaiah did none of these things. He simply continued sitting still as a statue. The second movement began with Isaiah exactly as he'd been. Hands on keys, eyes on the piano, utterly motionless. But the audience was no longer still. The discomfort had transformed into agitation. More people were whispering now, some not bothering to keep their voices down. This is ridiculous. I want my money back. Someone should stop this. A man in a tuxedo stood up in the orchestra section. "Excuse me," he called out to the stage. "Mr. Bennett, is everything all right? Do you need medical attention?" Isaiah didn't respond, didn't move. The man stood there for a moment, uncertain, then slowly sat back down. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, 15 seconds. Someone started clapping slowly, sarcastically. The sound was sharp and mocking. A few others joined in. It wasn't applause, it was contempt. A woman stood up and began walking toward the aisle. Then another person. Then several more. The exodus was beginning. People were leaving, walking out of Carnegie Hall of Isaiah Bennett's performance with disgust on their faces and anger in their movements. Unbelievable! What a waste of time! I thought he was supposed to be a genius. But not everyone was leaving. Some people sat forward in their seats, suddenly understanding. This wasn't a breakdown or a mistake. This was intentional. This was the performance. The silence itself was the art. In the front row, the old jazz musician sat with his eyes closed, a slight smile on his face. He understood. This wasn't Cage's silence about the impossibility of true quiet. This was something else. This was protest. This was resistance. This was a black man in America's most prestigious concert hall saying, "I will not perform for you. I will not entertain you. I will make you sit in discomfort the way my people sit in suffering." 2 minutes, 45 seconds. More people were leaving now. The sounds of exit were loud seats, flipping up doors, opening footsteps on marble. But those sounds were part of the performance, too. They were the ambient noise Cage had talked about. They were the sounds of people confronting art that refused to give them what they wanted. 3 minutes. The second movement ended. Isaiah remained motionless. The audience was now split clearly. Maybe a third had left. Another third sat in angry confusion, torn between walking out and staying to see what happened next. And the final third, including many of the black audience members, some younger white people, some artists and intellectuals, sat in rapt attention, understanding they were witnessing something historic. 3 minutes, 10 seconds. Isaiah remained still. Then, from speakers hidden in the walls of Carnegie Hall, a sound emerged. It started quietly. A murmur at first, barely audible. Then it grew. Voices. A crowd of voices. Singing. "We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday." The freedom song. The anthem of the civil rights movement. The voices were real, recorded from actual marches and protests. Black voices, white voices, young and old, united in song and purpose. The audience froze. Those who had been standing preparing to leave sat back down. Everyone was transfixed. Isaiah still hadn't moved, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full. Full of these voices, these testimonies, this evidence of struggle and hope. The singing faded, replaced by another sound. Martin Luther King's voice, recorded from the March on Washington just 2 weeks earlier. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." King's voice rang through Carnegie Hall with the power of prophecy. Some audience members began to cry. Others sat rigid, uncomfortable with this intrusion of politics into their cultural sanctuary. King's voice faded. There was a moment of silence. True silence, and then new sounds emerged. Dogs barking, vicious, aggressive barking, the sound of police dogs during Birmingham protests, then water high-pressure fire hoses, then screams, children screaming. The audience recoiled. Some put their hands over their ears. This was too much. Too real, too painful. They'd come for beautiful music, for art, for escape. Instead, Isaiah was making them hear the ugly truth. The sounds continued, overlapping now. Songs and speeches and screams and the mechanical sounds of violence, and woven through it all periods of silence. Deliberate silence. The silence of those who watched injustice and said nothing. The silence of complicity. The silence of graves. 4 minutes. 4 minutes, 15 seconds. Then the most terrible sound of all. An explosion. The sound of the bomb at 16th Street Baptist Church. The sound that had killed 4 little girls. The sound that had shattered a community and a nation's conscience. The explosion echoed through Carnegie Hall. In its wake, absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence after the bomb was more powerful than any sound that had come before it. 4 minutes, 25 seconds. In the silence, a child's voice. A recording of a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, singing by herself. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." The voice was pure, innocent, heartbreaking. It sang the simple children's song with all the hope and faith of someone too young to understand how cruel the world could be. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine." 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The child's voice faded. The final 3 seconds of 4:33 passed in complete silence. The deepest silence of the evening. The silence of 2,000 people confronting what they'd just heard. The silence of recognition. The silence of shame. The silence of understanding. 4 minutes, 33 seconds. The performance was over. Isaiah lifted his hands from the keys. Slowly, deliberately. He stood up from the piano bench, turned to face the audience. The hall was completely silent. No one moved. No one knew how to react to what they'd just experienced. Isaiah looked out at them, at the faces staring back at him. Some were crying openly. Some looked angry. Some looked stunned. Some looked transformed. He bowed. Once. Deeply. Not in supplication, but in acknowledgement. "I see you. I honor what we've just shared." Then he straightened and stood there waiting. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then, from the front row, the old jazz musician stood up. He began to clap, slowly, not sarcastically as someone had done during the performance. Earnestly, respectfully, powerfully. Another person stood and joined him, then another, then a dozen, then more. The black audience members mostly, but not only them, young white people, artists, anyone who understood what they'd witnessed, but many remained seated, some with their arms crossed, some with tears on their faces, but unable to applaud what felt like an assault on everything they thought music should be, and some simply walked out shaking their heads, muttering about the death of art. The standing ovation was split. Maybe half the remaining audience was on their feet clapping. The other half sat in silence or left. Isaiah stood on the stage and accepted both responses, the applause and the rejection. Both were valid. Both were part of what he'd known would happen. After several minutes, he raised his hand, and the applause died down. People sat. Those who'd been leaving paused, curious. Isaiah spoke. His voice was clear and calm, amplified by the excellent acoustics of Carnegie Hall. Thank you for being here tonight, for staying, for listening. What you heard, or rather what you didn't hear, and then what you did hear, was my attempt to honor two things. First, John Cage's 433, a revolutionary work that challenged us to rethink what music is and what silence means. And second, the reality of being Black in America in 1963. He paused, letting the words settle. I didn't play the piano tonight because my people can't speak, because the voices of Black Americans are systematically silenced, ignored, dismissed. I sat in silence to represent the silence of a nation that watches children being murdered and does nothing. The silence of white moderates who preach patience while my people die. The silence of institutions that claim to be colorblind while perpetuating discrimination. Someone in the audience shouted, "This is a concert hall, not a protest." Isaiah nodded. You're right, this is a concert hall. It's supposed to be separate from politics, from the ugliness of the world, a sanctuary of beauty and culture. But that separation is a luxury that my people don't have. We don't get to separate our art from our lives, our music from our struggle. So tonight I brought the struggle here. I made you sit with the sounds that America tries not to hear. The voices, the violence, the hope, and the horror. He looked out at the audience, meeting their eyes. Some of you are angry right now. You feel tricked, cheated. You came from music and got politics. I understand. But I would ask you to sit with that anger for a moment and ask yourself, why does it make you so uncomfortable to be reminded of injustice? Why is it acceptable for Black musicians to entertain you, but not to challenge you? Another pause. Tonight was not about abandoning music. It was about expanding what music can be, what it can say, who it can serve. It was about using this stage, this platform, this moment to bear witness to what is happening in our country, to refuse to look away, to refuse to be complicit through silence. Isaiah's voice grew stronger. The sounds you heard were real. Real voices from real marches. Real violence from real protests. Real children singing real freedom songs. And yes, the real sound of a bomb that killed 4 little girls in Birmingham just 3 weeks ago. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair. Their names. Say their names. Remember them. The hall was utterly silent now. Every person listening. I know this performance will be controversial. I know some of you will write that I've betrayed classical music, that I've politicized art, that I've wasted my talent on a stunt. But I would rather be controversial than complicit. I would rather risk my career than pretend that music exists in a vacuum, separate from the world that creates it. Isaiah took a breath. John Cage taught us that there is no such thing as silence. That even in the absence of intentional sound, there is always something to hear. Tonight, I wanted to make sure you heard what America tries to ignore, the sounds of struggle, the sounds of hope, the sounds of violence and resistance. And yes, the sound of silence itself, the silence that lets injustice continue. He stepped back from the microphone, then forward again. Thank you for listening. Not just to the sounds, but to the silence. Not just tonight, but I hope in the days to come. Listen to what's not being said. Listen to who's not being heard. And then I hope you'll find you can no longer stay silent. Isaiah bowed once more. Then he turned and walked off the stage, leaving the audience in stunned silence. Behind him, chaos would soon erupt. But in that moment, as he walked into the wings, Isaiah felt something he hadn't felt in years. Free. The moment Isaiah left the stage, Carnegie Hall erupted. Not in applause, but in argument. The audience, which had been held in collective silence by the performance, now burst into heated debate. "That was brilliant," someone shouted. "That was a disgrace," someone else countered. People turned to each other, strangers engaging in passionate discussion. What had they just witnessed? Was it art or propaganda? Genius or gimmick? A profound statement or a betrayal of music itself? In the lobby, as the audience filtered out, the arguments continued. A white woman in an evening gown confronted a young black man. "Music shouldn't be about politics," she insisted. "Art should be beautiful, should lift us above the ugliness of the world." "Easy for you to say," the young man replied. "Your world is already beautiful. Mine isn't. Why shouldn't our art reflect our reality?" Critics rushed to the lobby payphones to call in their reviews before deadlines. Their takes were sharply divided. The critic from the New York Times, a man who had previously praised Isaiah's remarkable technique, was harsh. His review, which would appear in the next day's paper, called the performance a troubling descent into political theater and suggested that Isaiah had squandered his considerable gifts on a provocative but ultimately hollow gesture. But the critic from the Village Voice, a younger man with more progressive sympathies, wrote a glowing review. He called it the most important performance of the decade and a necessary confrontation with America's conscience. The black press had a different perspective altogether. The Amsterdam News, Haarlem's leading newspaper, devoted their front page to the performance. "Isaiah Bennett breaks the silence," read the headline. The review celebrated his courage and called the performance a watershed moment when a black artist refused to simply entertain and demanded that white America listen to black truth. But even within the black community, reactions were mixed. Some jazz musicians felt Isaiah was appropriating black struggle for a white art form. "He's making political art in a concert hall for white people," one critic said. "Why not use his platform to support actual black musicians and black music?" Others defended him. "He's one of ours," they argued. "He's using the tools, he has the platform he's built to say something important. Don't tear him down for that." 2 days after the performance, Isaiah held a press conference. The room was packed with journalists, critics, fellow musicians, and curious onlookers. Cameras flashed as Isaiah entered and took his seat behind a simple table with a microphone. He had prepared a written statement, which he read in a clear, steady voice. "Thank you all for coming. I want to address what happened at Carnegie Hall and why I made the choices I made. First, I want to acknowledge John Cage, whose pioneering work 433 opened the door for my performance. Cage taught us that silence is never truly silent, that there is always something to hear if we listen carefully. My performance was built on that foundation, but with a specific purpose related to my experience as a Black American. Second, I want to be clear about my intention. This was not a stunt or a publicity grab. It was a sincere attempt to use my platform as a classical musician to address the crisis of racial injustice in America. I chose silence, and then sound specifically the sounds of the civil rights movement to make a point that I believe is crucial, that art cannot and should not be separated from the world in which it is created. Some have accused me of politicizing music, but music has always been political. The concert hall itself is a political space. Who gets to perform there? Who gets to sit in the audience? What music is considered serious and what is dismissed as entertainment or folk art? These are political questions. By pretending that classical music exists above politics, we simply reinforce the political status quo. I performed in silence because silence is what Black Americans experience when we try to speak about our oppression. Our voices are ignored, dismissed, drowned out. I wanted to make that silence visible, or rather audible. I wanted a primarily white audience to experience the discomfort of not getting what they expected of having their expectations subverted the way Black people's expectations are constantly subverted in America. And then I broke that silence with the sounds of the civil rights movement. Not because those sounds are inherently musical, but because they are the sounds America needs to hear. The voices of protesters, the words of Dr. King, the violence of oppression. And yes, the sound of that bomb in Birmingham that killed 4 children. Some of you have asked why I chose Carnegie Hall for this statement. Why not a church in Harlem? Why not a protest march? Why this space? Because this space represents cultural authority in America. What happens at Carnegie Hall is deemed important, worthy of preservation and discussion. By bringing the civil rights struggle into Carnegie Hall, I was demanding that it be taken seriously, not just as a political movement, but as a cultural and artistic force. I know my career may suffer for this choice. I know that some orchestras may no longer want to work with me. Some presenters may see me as too controversial. That's a risk I'm willing to take. Because some truths are more important than career advancement. Finally, I want to address my fellow Black musicians who feel I've betrayed our traditions by working in classical music. I understand your concern, but I would argue that my presence in this space, using this platform to speak Black truth, is itself a form of resistance. I'm not abandoning Black culture. I'm expanding where Black voices can be heard and what they can say. Music saved my life. The piano gave me a way out of poverty and oppression. I will always be grateful for that. But gratitude doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean pretending that everything is fine. It means using the gifts you've been given in service of something larger than yourself. That's what I tried to do at Carnegie Hall. Whether I succeeded or failed, history will judge. But I can say with certainty that I was true to myself and my people. And that matters more to me than any review or award. Thank you. Isaiah stood, gathered his papers, and left without taking questions. The room erupted in shouted queries and camera flashes, but he was already gone. In the weeks and months following the Carnegie Hall performance, Isaiah's life changed dramatically. Some consequences were exactly what he'd feared. Several prestigious orchestras canceled planned performances. His recording contract was not renewed. Some venues told his manager they didn't want to risk the controversy. But other opportunities opened up. Progressive organizations invited him to perform at fundraisers for civil rights causes. Universities asked him to give lectures about art and activism. Younger musicians, both Black and white, sought him out as a mentor and inspiration. Isaiah's career didn't end. It transformed. He would never again be the mainstream classical pianist he'd been working toward. But he became something potentially more important, a symbol of artistic courage and social consciousness. He continued to perform, but his repertoire changed. He began incorporating works by Black composers who had been systematically excluded from the classical canon. He created programs that mixed traditional classical pieces with jazz, blues, and gospel, breaking down the artificial barriers between high and low culture. He also used his platform to support the civil rights movement directly. He performed at benefits to raise money for legal defense funds. He participated in the March from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, playing a portable keyboard during rest stops to keep morale up. Most importantly, he continued to challenge classical music's unspoken rules about what could be performed and discussed. He gave pre-concert talks that contextualized the music historically and politically. He commissioned new works from Black composers. He insisted on integrated orchestras and racially diverse audiences. The Carnegie Hall performance became legendary. At first, it was controversial, something people argued about, disagreed over, used as an example of either artistic courage or artistic betrayal, depending on their perspective. But as the years passed and the civil rights movement progressed, the performance took on new meaning. It was studied in music schools as an example of avant-garde performance art. It was analyzed in history classes as a document of the civil rights era. It was celebrated in Black cultural spaces as a moment when a Black artist refused to play by white rules. By the 1970s, excerpts of the performance, the recorded sounds Isaiah had used, were being included in documentaries about the civil rights movement. The silence itself became a kind of historical artifact, a reminder of what it felt like to live through that turbulent time. Isaiah continued to evolve as an artist and activist. In the 1980s, he founded a music school in Harlem dedicated to teaching classical music to children from underrepresented communities. He believed that Black children deserved access to all musical traditions, not just those deemed authentically Black. He never apologized for the Carnegie Hall performance. When asked about it in interviews, he would say simply, "It was what needed to be done at that moment. I'd do it again." In 1993, exactly 30 years after the original performance, Carnegie Hall invited Isaiah to recreate it. He was 68 years old by then, his hair gray, his hands showing the first signs of arthritis. The invitation was itself a form of vindication. The institution that had hosted his most controversial moment now wanted to honor it. Isaiah agreed, but with modifications. This time, the performance wouldn't be purely silent. He would play after the 4:33, performing a piece he'd commissioned from a young Black composer specifically for this anniversary. The piece was called After Silence, and it used the sounds of the 1963 performance as its foundation-building music around and through those historical recordings. The anniversary performance was attended by many of the same people who had been there 30 years earlier. The old jazz musician from the front row was there now in his 90s, still nodding his approval. Some of the people who had walked out in 1963 came back curious to see if they would understand it better with the perspective of 3 decades. And of course there were young people. A new generation who had grown up hearing about Isaiah Bennett's radical performance, who saw him as a pioneer of using art for social justice. This time, the performance received a unanimous standing ovation. Not because everyone agreed with Isaiah's artistic choices, but because everyone recognized the historical importance of what he had done. The silence that had once been controversial was now celebrated as a watershed moment in American cultural history. Today, Isaiah Bennett is remembered as one of the most important classical musicians of the 20th century. Not because he was the most technically proficient pianist, though he was certainly excellent. Not because he recorded the most albums or won the most awards, but because he understood that being an artist meant more than just performing. It meant taking risks. It meant using your platform to speak truth. It meant being willing to sacrifice comfort and approval in service of something larger. The Carnegie Hall performance is now studied in music conservatories around the world, not just for its musical innovation, but for what it represents about the relationship between art and social justice. It's an example of how silence can be more powerful than sound, how absence can communicate more than presence. Musicians continue to be inspired by what Isaiah did. Contemporary artists who use their work to address social issues often cite him as an influence. The idea that art should stay out of politics has been thoroughly challenged in part because of performances like Isaiah's. But perhaps the most important legacy is more personal. Every time a young Black musician sits at a piano in a prestigious venue, they do so in part because Isaiah Bennett insisted on being heard even when what he had to say was silence. Every time an artist chooses courage over comfort, principle over popularity, truth over approval, they walk a path that Isaiah helped clear. And every time someone encounters injustice and refuses to stay silent, they honor the lesson Isaiah taught on that August night in 1963, that silence can be many things. It can be complicity, it can be oppression, but it can also be power resistance and truth. The choice is always in how we use it. Isaiah Bennett passed away in 2008 at the age of 73. He died peacefully, surrounded by family, in the same Harlem apartment where he'd spent most of his adult life. On his piano was the score to Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, which he'd been practicing until his final weeks. His funeral was held at the Riverside Church, the same church where Martin Luther King Jr. had delivered his famous speech against the Vietnam War. The service was attended by thousands. Classical musicians, jazz musicians, civil rights leaders, students, and ordinary people whose lives he'd touched. At the service, a young pianist, one of Isaiah's students from his Harlem music school, performed. She played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece Isaiah had played for Mr. Freeman all those years ago in Birmingham. It was beautiful, technically perfect, emotionally rich. But before she played, she sat at the piano in complete silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The audience understood. They sat quietly, honoring both John Cage's innovation and Isaiah Bennett's courage, honoring the power of silence and the power of sound, honoring the long struggle for justice and the role artists play in that struggle. When the silence ended and the music began, many in the audience were crying, not from sadness, though there was sadness, but from the beauty of it all. The beauty of a life lived with courage. The beauty of art that refuses to look away from truth. The beauty of someone who used their gifts not just for personal success, but for collective liberation. Isaiah Bennett's story reminds us that art is never neutral. Every choice an artist makes, what to perform, where to perform, it for whom to perform, it is a political choice, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question isn't whether art should engage with politics. The question is what side we're on. In our own time, we continue to face questions about justice, equality, and who gets to speak and be heard. We continue to have debates about whether artists should stay in their lane or use their platforms to address social issues. We continue to argue about what belongs in concert halls and museums and galleries, and what should stay outside. Isaiah Bennett's answer was clear: everything belongs. All of human experience, the beautiful and the ugly, the celebratory and the painful, the comfortable and the challenging. Art that only offers comfort and escape is not fulfilling its highest purpose. Art should also challenge us, disturb us, make us think and feel and question. The next time you encounter silence, listen closely. What is it telling you? What truths are hiding in the spaces between sounds? What voices are being silenced? And why? And what will you do about it? Isaiah Bennett sat at a piano and refused to play. In doing so, he played the most important notes of his career. He created sound through silence music, through stillness, meaning through absence. He proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop. Stop performing. Stop entertaining. Stop making people comfortable. And in that stopping, in that refusal, create space for truth. His Carnegie Hall performance lasted only 4 minutes and 33 seconds, but its impact has lasted more than 60 years and continues today. Every time someone uses their art to speak truth to power. Every time someone refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. Every time someone risks their career, their comfort, their approval to stand for what's right. That's Isaiah Bennett's legacy. Not just the silence, but what the silence meant. Not just the performance, but the courage it took to perform it. So if you take nothing else from this story, take this: your voice matters. Your art matters. Your choices matter. And sometimes, paradoxically, the most powerful way to use your voice is to choose silence, the kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable enough to listen to what they've been ignoring. Isaiah Bennett broke silence by embracing it. And in doing so, he changed what was possible for every artist who came after him. If this story moved you, inspired you, or challenged you, I invite you to share it. Share it with artists who are struggling with what their art should say. Share it with activists who need to be reminded that there are many forms of resistance. Share it with anyone who needs to hear that courage is possible, that change is possible, that one person with conviction can shift the entire conversation. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of people who used their gifts to fight for justice, who refused to accept the world as it was and worked to make it what it should be, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Leave a comment telling me what you think, what you felt, what Isaiah's story means to you. Because these stories matter, not just as history, but as inspiration, not just as entertainment, but as education, not just as past, but as prologue to a future we're still creating together. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting through the silence and the sound, through the discomfort and the beauty. Thank you for being here. Now go forth and use your voice, whatever form that voice takes, to speak truth. And remember, sometimes silence speaks loudest of all.